Hey,
Did you hear?
Did you hear about the new podcast?
Hoy,
What's it called? It's literally called Psst. What?
there's a new
There's
podcast
a
out
new
right now.
podcast?
It's from Fil-CHA.
Filipinx AO sharing stories together, as in the Psst podcast.
All right, welcome back everyone to another episode of the Pilipinx AO Sharing Stories Together or PSST podcast. Today is September 12th, 2021. This is episode 10, COVID-19 effects on adolescents and young adults. Quick disclaimer, information is up to date as of today's recording or live stream on September 12th, 2021, but due to the circumstances surrounding COVID-19 information, may have changed by the time you view this episode. We also would like to acknowledge our presence on Indigenous land in which we stand. We express our gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory we reside on, and we honor the Indigenous peoples who have been living and working on this land since time immemorial. It's important that we understand the long-standing history that has brought us to reside on this land and to seek to understand our place within that history. We have closed captions on Zoom and Facebook. We have posted instructions in the chats and comments. My name is Bradley Ramos, pronouns he, him, his. The goal of the Filipinx AO Community Health Association, or Fil-CHA, formerly known as the Filipinx AO COVID-19 Resource and Response Team, or Fil-COVID, is to address the health disparities within the Filipinx AO community and provide policy recommendations and resources surrounding the needs of the community. We also aspire to serve as a network for the Filipinx AO community through collaboration between Filipinx AO scholars, community organizers, leaders, researchers, social workers, public health advocates and professionals, clinicians, and media. Me, myself, I am currently residing on Muwekma Ohlone land in San Jose, California. Professionally, I work as a clinical pharmacist. In addition to being a pharmacist, I'm also a big community health advocate with Capo Health Collective in the San Francisco Bay Area, and of course, with Fil-CHA. I will be a facilitator in this space, and I am happy to be joined by my co-host today, T.
Thank you so much, Bradley. My name is T. Divino. Pronouns are he, him, his. I currently reside on Lenape land in New Rochelle, New York. I'm a senior at Sarah Lawrence College, studying transnational adoption and Asian studies. In addition, I'm the co-chair of an Asian American student organization on campus, as well as a campus mentor for other students of color. I'm also on Fil-CHA's networking and outreach team. Today, I am super excited to be a guest host on this episode of the PSST podcast. And I am incredibly excited to introduce our guest speaker for today, Lily Divino, who is not just special for her position, but also because she happens to be my tita. So take it away, Lily.
Hi guys, thanks so much. I'm excited to be here. So my name is Lily Divino. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I currently reside on Lenape land on the island of Manhattan, which is also known as Manhattan for many of you. And I am the director of New York City Health and Hospitals Adolescent Health Program. So I do work directly with the systems that serve adolescents here in New York City. By training, I'm a licensed clinical social worker and I have a public health degree. I also teach at NYU Silver School of Social Work, where for my other niche, which is trauma-informed care. And I am one of the founding members of Fil-CHA. And I also co-founded a local community health organization here on the East Coast, based in here in New York City, which is Kalasugan Coalition. And I'm really excited to be here.
Thank you so much. So before we begin today, I'd like to take a minute for some acknowledgements. A big thank you to the Association of Asian Pacific Community Health Organizations, or AAPCHO, for making this all possible. Also, this podcast was partially funded with generous support from the Walmart Foundation. Our podcast is also produced in partnership with We Can Do This and the Department of Health and Human Services. Today, we are going to be discussing COVID-19's effects on Filipinx AO adolescents and young adults. This is the 10th episode in the Filipinx AO Sharing Stories Together series surrounding COVID-19, and this follows our previous episode on parenting, family dynamics, and school rollout during COVID-19. Throughout this episode, we will be covering topics including how youth can combat misinformation and keep their families safe, how adolescents and young adults have experienced COVID-19, how parents, caregivers, educators, and other adults can support youth during this time, and some key strategies and resources to help youth navigate COVID-19. For the purposes of today's episode, we will be defining adolescents as those of ages 12 to 17, and young adults as those of ages 18 to 24. We may also reference adolescents and young adults simply as AYA or AYAs. Throughout this episode, we will be accepting questions, and we will do our best to get to those questions throughout the conversation. Now, with that all out of the way, I would love to hand it over to Bradley for our first question of the day.
Yeah, all right, let's get this episode really started. I'm excited to bring up the first question. So, Lily, what is the responsibility of adolescents, young adults in helping combat COVID-19? And how can the youth educate their families on vaccine culture and being safe in general?
Great. Yeah, that's an important question. So first of all, I want to emphasize adolescents and young adults actually can take care of themselves. They can make informed decisions about what's going on with correct information. And they can also be positive advocates and role models for their families, peers, and communities. So first and foremost is, practicing physical and social distancing, whether they are vaccinated or not, depending on the group that they're with. Because if they're with high-risk populations, say like family members who have either, certain medical conditions, or the elderly, it's more protecting not only themselves, but family members and those they care about them in those, definitely those groups. And if they have younger siblings, it's really important because even though there's nothing yet and still down the pipeline to get a vaccine for the younger kids, like younger kids are still, can carry the virus. Getting vaccinated, I think that's definitely a big push now, especially now where we are able to give it ages 12 and up. So if they have the opportunity to get vaccinated, I definitely encourage that, and to learn more about it if they still have questions. Another part is also not to forget to take care of your regular health. Still go to the doctor, still get your immunizations. And, even before COVID, there, adolescents and young adults have experienced their own mental health stressors. And we'll talk a bit later, I think it may come up later where we talk about the difference of the impact on their mental health as a result of COVID. But, unfortunately, the same stressors are there pre-COVID for mental health. So make sure you're also still getting someone to talk to, getting the resources you need to, get through, stress, the usual stressors of adolescent development into adulthood. So I think, as adults, we shouldn't take their voice for granted. They are the next generation. And I also want to just call attention, there are actually a lot of adolescents and young adults who are encouraging, their family members. They're worried about their younger siblings or their Lolas and Lolas, So I think giving them the right information, they actually are part of the community that we, sometimes we forget that they have a role and a voice. I think what I really want to stress as examples are people like Ruby Ibarra, scientists by day, promoting the vaccine by night, the other days, other times of her hours. Definitely great representation. I think just recently, Olivia Rodrigo, that was really important that she, speak and represent a younger population, and doing public service announcements. And some of the work that we do is, again, because we ask questions and we engage youth in our Youth Leadership Council at New York City Health and Hospitals, they've actually come up with their own, strategies and projects. And these are adolescents and young adults ages 14 to 18. We work with them to come with strategies and projects to increase the visibility of adolescents who are actually overlooked in general. But they want to make sure in this time and age, they shed light on their experiences during COVID. And so, they still talk about resilience despite, all the struggles that we have. Projects that we've done are focus groups to see what they've been experiencing. They created a social milestone guide. They actually do vaccination outreach. They can do a lot. And last but not least, I just want to also give props to my nephew. I think what brought him here is me just having conversations with him, because again, adolescents are young and aren't necessarily going to just tell you about stuff. So when I learned about, advocacy he did in his own classroom at Sarah Lawrence, where he actually did a presentation of why he was concerned about, COVID in the Filipinx community. And it really was, part of his assignment, but he used it as a tool to educate his classmates and even probably your professor, why this is important to you. He had data. He talked about, personal stories with my mom, his Lola. It wasn't so much she had COVID, but in the midst of COVID, we couldn't go to help and support each other, which was really hard. So I think to end this question is, really, how can we, I think it's just help also and support adolescents and young to be engaged in decision-making about COVID-19 by giving the right information and also making sure we're checking in, because it has been fluctuating. We're kind of riding a wave of COVID where it's up, it's down, new variants arise. So, I think it's an ongoing conversation we need to have with our adolescents and young adults.
I'm wondering, thank you so much for that story, by the way, but I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more on these figures like Ruby Ibarra and Olivia Rodrigo, because I think something we should emphasize here is that these are both people who come from, the Filipinx community, right? Ruby Ibarra is from Tacloban City specifically, I believe, and Olivia Rodrigo is half Filipina, I believe. And so not only are they incredibly important in leading culture as well as leading these vaccine efforts, but the impact of seeing that sort of representation, I think, is important. But if you had anything else to say on that, that'd be great.
I think representation is the key word, and representation of different groups within our community. I'll even speak for myself. There's not many of us doing mental health. So when I see a Filipinx person who's doing mental health, like, oh my God, right? Same thing with, and I think also just developmentally appropriate. I think peers really listen more to their peers. So we also want to make sure our adolescents actually have the right information that they're giving to their peers. They also hear, unfortunately, the misinformation. There was a focus group that actually my youth had actually gone to, and I wasn't sure if it was them, but in that group, the adolescents were afraid about infertility, about the COVID vaccine. So, I think if you're going to advocate, just also make sure you're getting your information from legitimate sources. But yeah, key representation. I think it's really important that peers should present their peers.
Yeah, I mean, I loved how you mentioned the responsibility of us all, and it isn't just adults. And you already mentioned what T is doing. Great work that is, it doesn't have to be just, one part of the age range. I think adolescents and young adults play a huge role, especially when everyone is at the mercy of everyone's at the mercy of misinformation, disinformation, and that can come from anyone and everywhere and can affect any age group. And so I think adolescents and young adults have a lot of responsibility and really empowerment that they can make a difference and that their voices do matter in this. So I love that you talked about that. But I would like to get us onto the next question, because I think this is a big one. Actually, I'll let T bring up the next question.
Much
Sorry, I don't want to steal your thunder,
Thank you. Okay, so how have adolescents and young adults experienced and responded to COVID-19? This is one of my favorite questions.
Okay. Well, there's actually, for both groups, there's actually, obviously for most of us, by the way, change in routines, right? Specifically for adolescents and young adults, and I'll distinguish actually how, because it's nuanced because of the different, development of each age group. Breaking continuity of learning, and I think that was actually really covered really well at the last episode. So I recommend anyone for more about educational resources and support, definitely refer to our last podcast, which was pretty amazing. Break, and I mentioned earlier, continuity of health and mental health care. And then miss significant life events, so what's really important from early adolescence all the way to young adulthood, we do have really important benchmarks or social markers that actually are part of moving through, it's literally like what you would think of coming of age, graduations, birthdays. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And then also loss of security and safety. And it does look a little different for adolescents than it is for young adults because of just also, the level of resources and autonomy they have. So, for adolescents, as I mentioned, and so the speaker from last week was, last podcast was Adrian Julie Anastasio. I just want to reinforce from his talk, that school provides adolescents with essential developmental services. And that's not just learning information and knowledge. There's also occupational, behavioral, and speech therapy that a lot of kids who actually have, specific needs are not getting resources. So we need to keep that in mind. And even it's really important, as I mentioned, milestones. It could be even if you're on a sports team, championships and vocational skills. These are a lot of hands-on stuff that we still are trying to figure out. How do we still support that? Which actually is part of mental health, because if I don't feel I can do something, that impacts an adolescent's confidence and their idea of like what they can be in the future or what they have the potential for in the future. And obviously we talked a lot about, Zoom fatigue and being online. So I think really being creative and knowing how to do things differently, especially when they work with healthcare. Telehealth has been great. This has been a great push for telehealth, but there's just certain things that still have to happen in the clinic setting. And that's what we're still struggling with. Then the break in continuity of health and mental health that I mentioned. So there are certain immunizations that actually, and especially with the little kids, we've really been concerned because that's one thing you have to go somewhere to get immunization. So not only the COVID vaccine, we have to remember kids still need annual physicals. They need to get their flu shot, their tetanus, meningitis, and HPV, which actually is 2-dose. So please keep in mind, don't forget those things, because then we don't want another epidemic to rise because we're not protecting ourselves from these other things. And I know this is a mixed audience, please know adolescents and young adults are still having sex. So my concern is like not getting access to sexual and reproductive health, and they're still dating, and we need to be concerned with peer and dating relationships. There's a positive going online for social connection, but it also has increased things like cyberbullying, cyber stalking, doesn't mean that they're not experiencing like unhealthy relationships online. And then for kids to, especially for many of us who have maybe experienced anti-Asian hate as a result of COVID, it's always been an issue for our API youth. It's escalated, unfortunately, with anti-Asian hate. So parents and those who work with adolescents and young adults, we need to make sure that what they're also are they online and it's safe. Then we have seen the rise of anxiety and depression among youth. I mean, also many adults too, specific to COVID because of that, the loss of their former life. So there's a different grief that people haven't experienced, not just the grief of losing someone maybe to COVID, but the grief of like, what's my life now going to be? I thought I had XYZ to look forward to, but what does that look like now that school's closed? I can't get a job now, So, so those are some of the things, particularly for young adults. So there's a shift, especially like here in the US, 18 just opens up a lot of things. So there's a lot of transition happening from adolescent, young adult, new job. You're going to college, maybe you're going to campus, and that all got shut down. And that's where you could also gotten your health care, So just being able to understand, especially if you're older, you may be able to get eligible to like public safety networks, like federally qualified health centers are an opportunity if your medical clinic has closed. Utilizing, if you're on campus, resources for professional development, still utilize it. I think a lot of them have done, have switched to, online support. And then, again, with young adulthood, they may be already living on their own. Maybe they're living with their partner already. So being mindful, what I've seen is what we call it's been a secondary epidemic, particularly with young adults and older and adults, is unfortunately intimate partner violence has increased because there is no way to go. For adolescents, there may be violence at home, and now they can't access the resources which are externally. We also need to be mindful is like how is it safe at home? Not even with COVID, is it safe to actually be at home? So those things unfortunately have not gone away, and unfortunately have gotten worse because of COVID. Making sure that young adults who are involved, who are actually supporting and being part of the community, I think as adults, we want to make sure that also we're teaching right away young adults about self-care. Take a break. You got to take care of your mental health. You got to take care of somebody else. So, I think having them, how do we build resilience, autonomy, but also recognizing they also still have the basic healthcare and mental health needs to still be taken care of.
Absolutely. I think it's kind of, sorry, Bradley, if you want to go, but I think it's kind of incredible, like how, you sort of articulated how all of these forces, all of these stressors are hitting at the same time. And so for a lot of these youth, like it's not just the pandemic, it's not just anti-Asian hate, it's everything. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit on, your personal experiences with the adolescents that you work with, and how like those specific stories sort of come into play here.
I think it's just asking them different questions too. So our Youth Leadership Council also was a learning curve, and it was an opportunity. Now that I look back on it, not only did we have to be creative, and also we didn't want to add another online thing until after school. So, I think what for me is because my background is in social work and doing group work, I found that I had to deal with my own frustration. If I had a whiteboard, if I was just, in the room, I could just see everybody's expression. So we had having conversation with you of kind of like, how do you communicate differently on an online platform? The other part is we deferred to them. Our model is youth engagement. So we weren't always the problem solvers. We also asked them, because obviously even with technology, they're gonna know more than me. We played around like what are good apps to actually introduce to make it more informational. And I think the added feature that helped a lot was not only did we have a group opportunity for them to interact with youth, which they did really need, and they needed still an adult, guidance and to give them structure. The two project managers who I have who work directly more on an ongoing basis with the youth, they also met with them individually. We assessed regularly, how are they doing in general, and how are they doing actually with a virtual platform? What can we do differently? And I think we grew with them too. And I think it wasn't just like a top down kind of approach. It was always tell us what you need to make it better, So I think that's kind of how you get also adolescents to level that power dynamic that can happen, And then the other thing is it's called the near to peer, model. T, you look at me surprised. You're actually part of it. So T actually was a panelist, for my Youth Leadership Council, and being in the moment. Not only were the youth wanting to know how do we get ready for college in general, but how do we do it during COVID? I had T talk to the youth along with his classmate who actually was a first year. I think it was really great that we had youth T who's a junior, but it was really also important because your friend who is a first year is closer in age. It really helped them to see not only what do we prepare for financial aid, what to expect and change and responsibilities in college, but also what's it like? What was it like having to do this during COVID? So I think, I think we have a lot of things we're learning from, and if it's working, then just sharing it, sharing knowledge. And I think, we want to structure a healthy adult relationships, near to peer relationships, and then, the peers being their own support network.
Bradley, I know I interrupted you, so sorry.
Oh no, I mean, I just, oh, Lily, I love everything that you're saying. Because I think it is important for folks to realize when we're thinking about adolescents and adults, you also have to meet them where they're at and include them in the conversation and empower them to speak how they're feeling and give them questions so that they have the space to talk about how they feel, because COVID-19 has just been so isolating. And like you mentioned, so many folks, adolescents and adults are in such big transitionary phases, and without the normal spaces for them to either talk to each other, people that are going through the same thing as them, it's those avenues just aren't as available. And I can't imagine someone having to go through the big transition of going to college. I've also heard there's very different experiences in spectrum. Some folks are actually on campus, some folks are not, and that is extremely challenging. They're not able to make the friends that they would have, like, in their first year in their dormitories and things like that. And so I'm glad that you mentioned self-care and that it's also important for us to check up on each other.
Bradley, you made me remember, because I'm talking to a lot, and just to make sure that we also acknowledge another group, not everybody goes to college. So, the difference for those who thought they can get a job, even if it was like, the entry level, many of them didn't have the opportunities anymore to start a job, looking for a job, right? And then on adolescents, some kids actually had to start working. So add that stress on because their parents lost their job, or so they are looking to help add to the income of the family. So, college life is definitely a huge impact and has changed. But there's also, remember, a group of adolescents who, are not coming also from, well-to-do, backgrounds, or their parents lost their job during COVID. So they're not having access even then to basic food, safe transportation, all the basic needs.
I know a pretty universal experience for, as we're talking about, like, not just college students, but like everyone in sort of this age group. Back in like spring of 2020, when, there's this sort of big push for young people to apply for jobs or internships, just any position that, will help them in their careers. Like, tons of people had received acceptances. And then when the pandemic hit, like, all of that was wiped clean. And so I know a lot of people expected by now that a lot of those opportunities would open back up. But what I'm hearing from a lot of people around me, and a lot of people my age, even those who aren't in college, is that those opportunities may have opened up, and that amount is already so small. But the ones that have opened up have, maintained such high hiring standards that, for those of us who have spent the better part of a year and a half inside, not being able to really update our resumes or acquire good experience, like, there hasn't been that way to really develop in a way to match these high standards. So a lot of people my age are sort of freaking out about how to join, the career field, like how to take that next step with the past year that's gone on. I don't know if you had anything to say about that.
Actually, no, thanks for reminding me. So we also take on interns, more graduate level, or, sometimes I look for someone who actually is looking for certain experience. And actually I had 2 interns this year where luckily it was work I could do. Again, this may not work with everybody, like whatever field you're in, but luckily my work was I was able to help one grad student, and she was actually trying to complete her, her practicum for her master's in public health. And the work that she was able to do was actually to be online. And actually she was based out in Hawaii. And so she couldn't even come in, but she did an amazing job of, like, she was doing program evaluation for me, which I didn't have time, but, but I still, want to make sure I provide mentorship to young adults or in the field of public health. Like, that is still like another mission of mine. And then another young woman, she was a doctoral student. And even though she was in Camden, New Jersey, it still needs to be remote. But I think creating opportunities, especially for young adults, to actually engage them and do some kind of work, if you can, if it doesn't necessarily have to be hands-on, but still, I still make sure I had weekly meetings with them so we can check in and monitor the work, because they are still like interns and still students. I think just keeping in mind, you also need to make time for it, but having these alternative types of ways of professional development for young adults is really important.
All right, perfect. I really appreciated that conversation. I'm sure a lot of people listening who, are my age or have had similar experiences, like, it's tough to find a lot of adults who sort of understand that struggle and understand, like, all the different forces sort of affecting us right now. So thank you so much for everything you've already said. I guess, Bradley, I think I'm going to hand it over to you for the next question.
Yeah. So let's go on to the next question, like T mentioned. How should parents, families, educators, and other adults support adolescents and young adults during this time, Lily?
So let me break this down by age group because it does look a little different, and I think it's more heavy on the adult adolescent side, as I mentioned, because a lot of them are still living at home, have parent involvement. I think first and foremost, is we can't forget that they still need to learn social skills, empathy, and responsibility. So how do we do that in the home setting, in school, with their peers and community? At home, if you have an adolescent, making sure, maybe engaging them in having decisions about in the house, and being clear also with if there's different age groups, like T, I'm thinking about, your siblings, the responsibility for T as a young adult would be different than your younger sister, make it age appropriate. But I think especially someone who's an older sibling, having it match their level of, ability, about having that engage, involving them then in problem solving and decision making. That actually for parents and caregivers, that actually might lighten your load, and for those who work with adolescents and young adults, it will also lessen your burden because at least it's effective if you're getting input from this age group. And what it helps build is a sense of purpose and self-worth. Like, wow, I'm contributing. Wow, this person really values what I'm saying. My thoughts and my actions are important. And it helps actually, especially now, to regain control. Wow, I actually can do this thing. Not everything is like, amorphous now. It's concrete. I think that's also really important. Make sure you give them concrete things that they also can see are tangible things that goals, and it could be small, it doesn't have to be a big thing. Building trust and independence. So I think that could be hard for certain communities. I think a lot of communities, particularly, depending on the generation, Filipinx, that we defer to the elders' authority. I think trying to find that blend of how can you trust your adolescent or young adult? You give them some liberty and some wiggle room to be independent. And then identify healthy outlets to express emotion. So one thing I didn't mention before is not only the basic needs of eating, sleeping, and keeping active, engage in their interests. So if they're into a sport, how to make sure that they can play a sport, but making sure the field and the school or the league is practicing, safety protocols. Engaging things which you actually could do online is cooking classes, writing, art, you can do dance, right? There's so many, that's what TikTok's for now, right? So, and then the other part is because if teaching them healthy ways to cope what's going on, the one thing that is still happening too is coping with substances that aren't helpful. Alcohol and other substances, the crazy, no matter what era, there's a pandemic, adolescents, are savvy enough to find who can get me that thing or that stuff, right? So you need to be mindful that if we don't teach them coping ones, then they may turn more and seek their own ways of coping, which may not be healthy, and it may be a substance that we're not, that actually can make it worse. Some substances actually can make you feel more depressed or anxious. Using technology in positive ways. So, and especially for adults, you still want to limit the amount of time, but, be flexible because that is now how all of us are kind of communicating more. And encourage with connecting with others. There's a lot of apps too, that you can share, still have a movie night, but at your own home, but you actually can talk to your friends about, oh my God, did you see that scene? That was nuts. And then, and making sure that, especially for the younger adolescents, where they're getting their information. Are they being bullied online? I think you want to make sure, oh, tell me or if they're actually telling you some misinformation, oh, tell me where'd you got that? What do you think about that? And maybe then you can counter what do you think about what people say about this though? And that's how you can actually have a conversation. It's actually where they're getting their information, how they're processing it, and then see if you can engage in well, let's take a look at, what actually, CDC says, or, more of these people that I think I would listen to more. And then, I think, there's things that I've done, even at health and hospitals, I've done like, how to work with adolescents and youth for parents who actually are healthcare workers. I think, checking in with your stuff too. I'm sure there's a lot of people in our field, in our community who are healthcare workers, checking yourself that you're not bringing that stuff at the workplace to your home. So you can separate, like, I don't want to talk about this anymore, but if your kid is kind of having a hard time, you kind of need to find a space for yourself so you can have a space for for the adolescent and young adult. Yeah, and there's like, if people want to learn more, you can contact me. There's activities that I actually do when I was doing more direct practice with adolescents. The key activities were to see what areas of control they have in their life and what they don't, and just being realistic about it. Doing a self-check for yourself, I think is actually good for adults too. What am I physically feeling? What emotions are coming? What thoughts are coming? And with no judgment. And then doing a reality check. Is this because I'm hearing all this information? I'm not having a break. Is this reality? And things like mindfulness or relaxation activities, even for 1 minute, can really just stop a thought that's like bugging you, or just just not gnawing at you. So those are the things for adolescents that we can't forget, because they still need to have these things. And then for young adults, again, it doesn't stop that you take care of your health. A lot of our initiatives are like, we actually do a lot of work of transitioning adolescent care to adult care, because they couldn't get lost in the shovel. So we just want to make sure they're taking care of their health, knowing what research they have, whether it's on campus or community health center, if they're moving out now, not going to your usual doctor, what are resources they can have. And then again, help encourage them to be the advocates then for their peers, for the younger generation. And then I think, yeah, for those, and again, what we mentioned earlier, how can we support them to keep working towards professional goals, personal goals, academic goals? Those things shouldn't stop, because especially here in the US, those are things that actually make us, independent, be able to have a safe life, or, more access to, things that we just need in the house, like food, clothing, and shelter.
You brought up so many good things, Lily. And I think there may be folks, because this is how I'm thinking myself, there may be folks who don't know where to start. Could you give an example of just starter questions, either, adults can ask adolescents or young adults, or educators can ask the adolescents, young adults in their lives? What starter questions could you ask to help get this conversation started?
Well, if we're talking to you about if things definitely have changed as a result of COVID, and you notice, I think this goes back to, your own kid, your own family member. If you notice a difference, like they're shutting down, or they're, again, it's either it's too much or too little of what you normally known about this person, then, just kind of mentioning it and be like, I noticed, you don't do this thing that you used to love anymore. What's happening? Again, being in a tone where it's like you're curious, an open-ended question is really important, because you also don't want to start telling what you should do. I don't think you start with problem solving or posing solutions. Give space to just explore and let them talk. And even if you don't know, and I think one important thing, having worked definitely with adolescents, if you don't know something, I think it's so meaningful. You're like, you know what? I don't have the answer. Let's look it up together. Let's figure this out together. I think asking, knowing what your limits are, and telling them when you don't know something, that also feel like, can be, because I think the one thing is they can feed off of that too, So the other piece is, if you're struggling with that, there are actually people in different fields who get a specific training of how to work with adolescents. I say that because we work with a lot of pediatricians, and some pediatricians, aren't necessarily comfortable talking to adolescents. So you want to make sure, if you seek other supports, that they're at what I say adolescent friendly. And you can definitely tell they're adolescent friendly when you look on their websites, how they, even like I'm talking about like health clinic, you can actually tell if you go to a clinic if it's adolescent friendly, because they have all these really the stuff that we don't want to talk about. They have posters about it, or the front desk to the provider asks like, hey, how are you feeling today? Or asking really those sensitive questions. The one thing that I've seen over time, because one of the reasons I went into working with adolescents, young adults, because there actually wasn't a lot of resources there. It is a specific skill set because they are challenging. There's a lot of also, those really icky topics that we don't even like to talk as adults, but the adolescents are already starting to think about, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, as I always say, and if we're not ready to answer that, then, nothing wrong with then finding people who can. I think, getting information and maybe just also getting pamphlets or leading, even if you're still struggling, leading into the websites, are reputable and have good resources for adolescents and young adults.
I love that whole point about how having these difficult conversations is like a great way to start these conversations. And I love how you also earlier in that we're talking about like TikTok and how making that like familial bond or that personal bond is just as important. So I think like stepping back and understanding supporting these youth is not just about asking them how they are and figuring out all their problems and trying to solve it for them. It's also about being there for them emotionally and not just as a guardian or a parent or a mentor, but also as another person who's also going through these times. I think that's such an important point, and something that I think a lot of struggling AYAs kind of need, I think.
And they still need structure, guys. It's not like you just let them take total over. I think but you still need to be in bed by this time. You still need to eat 3 meals a day. I think that also just sets up again. Even that's in basic self-care. Remember to take care of these things, because that actually can make you feel worse. You can even say that. So
absolutely.
Yeah, and I think it's just such a challenge because for many Filipino households, I think sometimes the adults may have challenges dealing with their own stressors. And so it may be even hard for them to know how to, approach, the adolescents and young adults in their family and that are close to them to talk about their stressors, because maybe they don't even know how to deal with it themselves in a healthy and productive way. So I just think about that, and that just even starting that conversation is such a challenge, especially in like Filipinx AO household.
Yeah, for sure. There's a reason why I'm in this field, by the way.
I mean, I think a great example of how both Lily and I are here, Tita Lily and I are here, is that, I one day just sort of felt like she was the only person who would understand my weird obsession with Ruby Ibarra and how like all these weird ideas of getting vaccines and developing the vaccine and Filipino culture, as well as like just general stress. Like, as much as I didn't know how to talk about that, I knew that there was someone who was experiencing it the right way. And so just sort of taking that leap and starting that conversation, obviously paid off really well for me. And I thought that was really beneficial.
And I think summing up what T said, I think that's what's important. And it is not everyone can, it is something to practice and get used to. I am not afraid of him teaching me stuff. I'm not afraid of my youth to teach me, and I joke with him, I was like, man, I feel really old, but thank you for, now I know something new, And so, I think they know a lot more than we give them credit for, but, the other part is, and there's not, I think we need to acknowledge that, as well as they don't still, but they still don't know everything. And not that they don't do anything, right?
Oh yeah, I agree. And sometimes, going back to the question, parents, families, educators, and other adults, we do have to step outside of ourselves and remember that adolescents and young adults bring so much to the table, and we have to be open that they may know things and see things that we don't, and that's valuable. And how they experience life and their experiences and their truth that they bring can reveal something that we may not have considered. So I love that it's important for us to be open-minded and to allow the adolescents and young adults in our lives to share their stories and how they feel.
And talking about stories, one other point, because I totally forgot, and actually it's really important. The arts are another outlet. Things that we've done with the youth is we've done photography where you don't even have to use words. They use photography to, show what they felt, what they're experiencing, to visualize it. T used his presentation, and it wasn't just data. It had video clips. Not even talking about social media. I think, again, going back to, Olivia Rodrigo using a platform where it was mass media, right? I think, there's a lot of resources out there, or there's a lot of ways that we can communicate and share information. And especially I'm talking because of our community. We're not saying going to talk about problems, but is there a way we can do it through video photography, through another form of communication, which is just as, it could be therapeutic and it could be very impactful.
Yeah, I agree. I personally have turned to a lot of writing. Journaling has been a great outlet. Dance is also a really great outlet for folks. So I agree. I encourage everyone, and not just, adolescents, young adults, but honestly, everyone, to do something that helps get their feelings out of their body, and to express themselves and how they feel. But I want to make sure that we leave time for our last question. T, would you like to bring in that last question?
Absolutely. Thank you, Bradley. Our final question is, what are some key strategies and resources that you think can help IAs navigate COVID-19?
So I think it's, I think I'm just kind of also reemphasizing, building coping skills, learning how to deal with different things, especially how to deal with anger, depression, or anxiety, because those are the things that people still, on the surface, that's what most people tend to connect with first. Right, especially with adolescents, they may not have all the words or the ways to communicate that. But the first things are like, I'm sad, angry, or happy. Giving more like a well-rounded, way of expressing themselves. I think for parents working in their adolescence, adjust expectations. I think COVID has forced all of us to adjust our expectations. The more so you need to do that now for adolescents. I mentioned encourage a daily schedule. Again, adolescents can do this, but we need to support them more to have a daily schedule for eating, sleeping, exercise, and socializing. Practice empathetic communication. And then making sure, and again, going back to making sure they keep themselves protected. Learn more about what's happening. Try to keep up to date from reputable resources what's happening with COVID. If the latest data has shown that, and it's mimicking what we see with adults, the states where adults and adolescents are not getting vaccinated they're getting the spikes, and they're getting the people who are getting hospitalized. Because people, when you're vaccinated, you may get sick, but you're at less risk to get hospitalized, which means it got bad, right? So that's happening to adolescents. Before, we didn't have to worry about adolescents, and I want the adolescents to know who are listening. We're seeing a whole different thing where it's actually adolescent patients who are adding to the burden of what we're seeing in COVID, especially in some of these states. And if you have questions, about, what's safe, I think if you go to a trusted adult, making sure you're checking in regularly with these reputable sources. And, I think finding ways, I think one thing that can be hard is like making sure you have other peers who also share your same beliefs. I think it could be hard, especially with adolescents, to be different. And actually that came up with some of the youth, they felt it was another type of peer pressure. That's kind of what came out. It's like, I know in New York City, unfortunately, what I've heard is like, kids will, rent somebody, or they'll go to somebody's apartment who's not as, who's pretty lenient about COVID vaccine. And there's these bunch of teenagers then partying in a closed space, that they're still trying to find ways to party. So you need to be careful, like, being mindful of, is that worth the risk? Especially knowing the Delta variant is different, and you may have elders or people in your family who have, medical conditions that actually you could put them at risk, as well as yourself. And then for young adults, I think it's just, how do we give them more skill sets? Listen, reflect, and normalize their experience. This kind of sucks, and that the things that you were looking for, they're not there. Let's find other things to look forward to. With them, you want to brainstorm solutions and give them more control of taking steps, but then checking in with them, make sure how to go. And then, I think for both groups, just reminding yourselves of reminding our youth and our adolescents and young adults about what actually has been positive of this. I think the work that I've done with our Youth Leadership Council, the one thing that they still were able to connect with is resilience. So adolescents, I think most people, we all have resilience, but I think with adolescents, we have to almost give them opportunities to show their resilience, to understand it. I think that's also why I work with adolescents and young adults, because the potential, and also what they, I think I have emphasized what they actually bring. But there's the potential of what they can be is pretty exciting to watch if we give them the right tools, if we give them the space, but also make sure that we have a safe holding place for them. I hope that answered the question.
Absolutely. I think those are amazing answers. I'm also wondering though, if there are more, small steps that people can take, in those larger pursuits. And, maybe this has to do with how do we communicate better? How do we, we're talking about, parents and caregivers and adults reaching out to their kids, but I think a lot of us, are in different parts of the world, different parts of the US, so how do we just make those small connections? What strategies can we really use?
I think because, especially we're at a small text, right? I think making sure you also not only, keeping up to date, but you also want to put limits on, your information and have it be a mix of things that are self-care and fun, keeping up to date with information. And, I think if you feel stuck and either if you can't reach out to a trusted adult or a peer, just making sure you're looking for things that, do they actually validate this information? Is it coming from a trusted resource? And then I think if you can't handle, I think one thing I want to make sure I emphasize, especially for those who are struggling with depression or anxiety, or, they are coping with unhealthy, behaviors. If this is happening for more than 2 to 4 weeks, I think that's actually a signal to get some kind of professional help. I was on this other webinar, and I don't mean just if you went to me, not just your aunt who's a social worker, there's still a limit to that, because at the end I'm still your tita, right? So my recommendation is okay, let's find a resource for you. I think we tend to, obviously, I think having our community is really important, don't get me wrong, but I think there's something when you're worried about mental health problems becoming mental illness and it's shutting somebody down or it's hurting other people. That's more than any of us can handle. I think remembering professional help is still out there. There's telehealth. I think the one positive with telehealth has created access to a lot of mental health resources. And then, just exploring if you have issues with insurance payment, I think that's where community health centers are going to be another avenue.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up that there should be at some checkpoint for you to start considering, hey, this may be something that I can't just hold on my own. So having that checkpoint is really important. I agree.
Before we move on, are there any resources that you wanted to highlight? Maybe websites, maybe phone numbers, organizations, anything you wanted to shout out?
Actually, as I was preparing this, one of the resources I really liked, the CDC actually had pretty good resources. And then they had links for other resources, because I think having something that's more national, it was really good. And then you can connect to your local areas. I know this is covering all of the US. And they actually have resources broken down by age group. And they focus more on mental health, but they have in the information a lot of what is the current COVID guidelines. I think you should also look at what your local state department may have are available, and making sure they have something specific to adolescents. I think that also shows that, they access sensitivity, and they understand that there's, a specific experience for adults and adolescents and young adults. I think there's a lot of hotlines too, like, especially with intimate partner violence and dating violence, the national hotline for domestic violence is always good research, and they can tap you into your local areas. I think having on hand, if you do have concerns about people, not doing really well, for substance abuse, SAMHSA, this is substance abuse mental health Services Association has good resources for mental health and for substance use. Those are the main ones. And then I know this is more on the East Coast, but another resource I go to is Child Mind Institute. And the American Academy of Pediatrics has really good resources, as well as the Society for Adolescent Health and Medicine. If you want to look more specifically for, because the Society for Adolescent, a lot of people are from the American Academy of Pediatrics, and they focus a lot more on the needs of adolescents and young adults.
Yeah, those are all amazing resources, especially like checking in with local government, CDC guidelines for your area. Like, those are great ways to sort of keep yourself grounded, and in addition to all these hotlines. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to hand it back over to Bradley.
All right. Well, thank you again, Lily. This wraps up the question portion, but is there any main takeaways you want our audience to walk away with?
Yes, and with that, I would like to speak while showing an image of, that my youth leadership council put together. So I'm going to share my screen for just a second. Give me 1 second here. So one thing is my main take is to recognize and address fear, stress, and behavior changes, and understand how it may differ for adolescents and for young adults. We want to make sure we can help them learn still how to, just in general, how to cope with stress and anxiety, and encourage them to stay socially connected in helpful ways for their mental health. We want to teach them and reinforce ways to protect not only themselves, but also protect others. So that they're not getting sick and they're not getting others getting sick, to slow the spread of COVID-19. So we want to make sure they get the right information to make their own informed decisions, So, again, one other thing, I think just making sure they're also maintaining other things like routine physicals. They're staying up to date with immunizations for those who need like other support services with behavioral health, occupational health, stay on top of those things. Those are really important. And then reminder that, adolescents and young adults can be their own advocates and role models for families, peers, and communities. So, especially for adolescents, they can be a role model for not only their peers, but maybe their younger siblings. And then for young adults, they can have more of a role in making a change as a community by helping others cope with stress and promoting healthy behaviors, but also you want to make sure you're taking care of yourself, and to balance all this work with self-care. And so this is an image of like how we actually, all that stuff we've been talking about, the youth actually, we did a focus group with them, and these are the key areas of what they've been impacted inside. Like, so they actually came up with so the left is the coronavirus, right? The right is, they actually thought of this as like the antibody. And so we pictured it as an antibody. So, and the protective shell is resilience, which has helped them with the disruptive relationships, the mental health, stressors during COVID, how technology and social media has been a positive and a challenge, but, by adults being involved, asking them, helping them foster, their own resilience, it will protect them from the impact of COVID. So I want to end it on that.
Oh, I love it. All right. Well, T, would you like to close us out for this episode?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Bradley. Tita Lily, thank you so much for being here and for sharing your wisdom with all of us. Thank you, everyone who watched this episode of the PSST podcast. As a quick reminder, our next episode will be episode 11, COVID-19 effects on the Fil-AM biracial/multiracial community, with special guest Asia Jackson. This episode will be coming out end of September, so please be on the lookout for updates about that. Of course, follow us on social media at Fil-XAO_CHA. That's FILXAO_CHA, and like us on Facebook. Again, thank you to AAPCHO, as well as the Walmart Foundation and We Can Do This and the Department of Health and Human Services for making this podcast possible. And of course, stay tuned for our next episode.
Woo, thank you, everyone.
Thank you. This is fun.